The carpenter built my dream home. Then he discovered a hidden skeleton. A dead man was buried underneath somebody's living room floor. Not in a cemetery, not in a grave, underneath the tiles of a home that a family had been sleeping in, eating in, raising children in for over 30 years. And the only reason anyone ever found out was because a carpenter named Chike picked up the wrong floorboard. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button before we go any further, because the story you're about to hear is one of those stories that will stay with you long after you finish watching. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Chike Okafor was not a man who talked much. He was the kind of person who let his hands do the speaking. His palms were calloused from 23 years of hammering, sawing, and shaping raw wood into something beautiful. In the town of Oguta, in Imo State, Nigeria, if you wanted something built right the first time, you went to Chike. Not because he was the cheapest, not because he was the fastest, but because he never cut corners, not once, not ever. He had a small workshop behind his house, and every morning before the sun fully committed to rising, Chike was already there, sanding something smooth, measuring something twice. His wife, Ngozi, would bring him tea and stand at the doorway watching him with that quiet kind of love that doesn't need words. They had 3 children. They were not rich, but they were comfortable. Chike had built their home himself, board by board, nail by nail. Every wall in that house had his fingerprints somewhere inside it. So when a man named Emeka Duru pulled up to Chike's workshop in a black Toyota Land Cruiser and said he wanted Chike to renovate his father's old compound, Chike should have said yes immediately. But something made him pause. He couldn't explain it then. He would be able to explain it much, much later. Emeka Duru was a tall man in his mid-40s, educated. He worked in Port Harcourt in the oil sector and had the posture of a man who had never been told no. He wore pressed trousers and a collared shirt with the sleeves rolled up, like he was trying to appear casual but failing. His shoes were too clean for the dusty red earth of Oguta. Everything about him said he had money and was used to people being grateful for the chance to work for him. My father passed away 4 months ago, Emeka said, as Sin sat across from Chike in the workshop, a rolled-up blueprint under his arm. He left us the family compound, old building. It needs complete renovation. New floors, new walls, new ceiling. I want it livable again. My mother wants to move back in. Chike nodded slowly. When did your father build the compound? Emeka thought about it. My grandfather built it. My father grew up there. I grew up there. It's been in the family since the late 1960s. So, more than 50 years old, Chike said. The structure will need full inspection first. Old buildings have surprises. Emeka smiled the smile of a man who did not believe in surprises. That's why I'm hiring the best. Chike took the job. The Duru compound sat at the edge of town, just off the main road, hidden behind a row of old mango trees that had grown so thick their branches tangled together overhead like fingers locking. The compound itself was big, 3 main buildings arranged in a U-shape around a central courtyard in the old style. Red brick walls, corrugated iron roofing gone orange with rust. Concrete floors cracked down the middle like a map of old wounds. The place smelt of dust and old wood and something else, something Chike couldn't name at first. He brought 2 of his workers with him. Udo, a young man of about 25 who was built like he wrestled trees for sport, and a quieter man called Tobena who was 53 and had been working with Chike for almost a decade. They walked through every room. Chike marked things with blue chalk, cracks, soft spots, sections of wall that sounded hollow when you knocked on them. He wrote everything in a small notebook with a pencil stub he kept behind his ear. The main parlor, what would become the living room, was the worst of it. The floor had been tiled at some point, but the tiles were cheap and old, and half of them had cracked or shifted. Underneath, Chike knew, would be the original concrete slab. He needed to see the state of it to know whether they could retile over it or needed to break it up entirely and lay a new one. That was on day 3. Day 3 is when everything changed. Udo had started at the far end of the parlor, chipping up the old tiles with a chisel and mallet. Tobena was working on the walls, scraping off old plaster. Chike was in the room adjacent, sketching measurements, when Udo called out to him. Not with urgency, not with panic, just a flat, strange kind of voice. The voice of a man who was not quite sure what he was seeing. Oga Chike, come and look at something. Chike came into the parlor. Udo was standing very still, which was unusual for a man who was almost always in motion. He was staring down at a section of floor he had just cleared of tiles. The mallet hung loose at his side. Chike crouched down. The concrete there was different. He saw it immediately. The rest of the slab was uniformly grey, poured all at once, smooth with age. But in this one section, roughly rectangular, about 1.5 meters wide and 2 meters long, the concrete was slightly darker. The texture was finer. The edges, when you looked closely, showed a seam, a clear, deliberate seam. Someone had poured this section separately after the original slab. Someone had dug up the floor and then resealed it. Chike put his hand flat on the surface. It felt the same as the rest, but it wasn't. He looked up at Udo. Udo looked back at him. Tobena had appeared in the doorway. He looked at the floor. He looked at Chike. And then, very quietly, he said, "We should call the owner." Here is where a less careful man would have made a terrible mistake. Here is where some workers would have quietly patched that floor back up, said nothing, taken their pay and gone home. Because what you don't know can't hurt you. Isn't that what people say? But Chike was not that kind of man. He called Emeka Duru. He described what he had found, carefully, professionally, without drama. Just the facts. Unusual concrete patching, clear evidence of a section that had been repoured after the original slab. Chike said he needed guidance on how to proceed. There was a long silence on the phone. Then Emeka said, "Are you sure?" "I am sure," Chike said. Another silence. Then, "I'm coming." Emeka arrived 2 hours later. He came alone this time, no driver. He walked into the parlor and looked at the floor for a long time without saying anything. His jaw was tight. His hands, Chike noticed, were perfectly still at his sides, the kind of stillness that only comes when you are working very hard to appear calm. Could it be old repairs? Emeka asked. Cracks they fixed. The patch is too deliberate, Chike said. Too big. And the shape of it, he gestured at the neat rectangle. Repairs don't look like this. Emeka stared at the floor. What are you suggesting? He asked. Chike chose his next words very carefully. I am not suggesting anything. I am telling you what I found. What we do with that information is your decision. But I cannot, in good conscience, continue work on this floor without you knowing. Emeka was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Open it." They broke through the patch the following morning. Chike had spent a restless night. Ngozi could tell something was wrong. She asked him twice and he said he was tired. He wasn't tired. He was the kind of uneasy that sits between your shoulder blades and doesn't let you breathe deeply. When the chisel broke through the patched concrete, the smell hit them before anything else did. Not a fresh smell, not the smell of something recent. This was decades old, dry and ancient and heavy, a smell of earth and something organic that had long since been processed by time into something quieter, more settled. It was the smell of deep time, of something that had been underground for a very, very long while. Udo stepped back. Tobena crossed himself. Chike crouched at the edge of the opening and looked down. In the shallow pit beneath the floor, less than a meter deep, tight and rectangular as a coffin without a box, lay the skeleton of a man. Not scattered, not disrupted. Laid out flat, arms at the sides, legs straight, the skull facing upward, the empty eye sockets looking at the ceiling of the parlor that had been above it for decades. The bones were dark with age and earth. Fragments of cloth, long rotted into dark fibers, clung here and there. A small metal object lay near where the right hand had rested, a ring, corroded green with time but still holding its shape. No one spoke for a very long time. Then Chike straightened up and said, "We are stopping work and we are calling the police." Now, before I tell you what happened next, I need you to do one thing for me. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because this story is about to take a turn that you absolutely did not see coming, and I need you to still be here for it. Subscribe, hit the bell, and stay with me. The police came. 2 officers first, then more, then the detective unit from the nearest station. The bones were photographed, documented, and eventually removed. A forensic team was brought in. The compound became a crime scene, wrapped in yellow tape, the mango trees standing silent witness around it. Emeka Duru gave a statement. He said he knew nothing about the remains. He had not known of any burial beneath the floor. His father had died 4 months ago. His grandfather, the original builder of the compound, had died in 1991. He had no explanation. He appeared calm. He appeared calm in exactly the way that a man who has practiced appearing calm appears calm. But here is what Chike noticed, because Chike noticed things. When the detective asked Emeka how old the bones appeared to be, Emeka said, "I have no idea." But when the detective turned away to write something, Emeka looked at the pit one more time, and in that brief, unguarded moment, something moved across his face. Not shock, not horror, not even sadness. Recognition. Chike saw it, and Chike did not forget it. The forensic report took 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, Chike's contract was suspended. The compound was still sealed. He had workers who needed to be paid and a client who had gone very quiet. Emeka answered calls occasionally, but said little. He had engaged a lawyer. The whole thing had taken on the cold, formal shape of a legal matter. But Chike was not finished thinking about it. He began asking questions quietly, not to the police, not to any official, just to old people in Oguta who had long memories and longer tongues. He started with a woman called Mama Nkeruka, who was 81 years old and had lived in that neighborhood since she was a young woman, and who knew the history of every compound on that road the way some people know the names of their own children. He brought her palm wine, the good kind, and sat with her on her veranda as the evening cooled, and he asked her about the Duru family. Mama Nkeruka looked at him for a long time before she said anything. Then she said, "Which part of the story do you want? The part they tell or the part they buried?" Chike said both. What Mama Nkeruka told him took more than an hour and a full gourd of palm wine. The Duru compound, she said, had been built in 1968, just after the Civil War. Old Sylvester Duru, Emeka's grandfather, built it fast, which was unusual. Most people were struggling to rebuild their lives in those years, but Sylvester had money, and people in the neighborhood wondered where it came from. Sylvester had a business partner before the war, a man named Ike Ezenwachi. The two of them were close, childhood friends, went to school together, started a trading business together. During the war, they separated. When the war ended, Sylvester came back with money and built his compound. Ike Ezenwachi never came back at all. His family waited for years. His wife, his children, they inquired, they searched. Everyone assumed Ike had died in the war. Hundreds of thousands had. It was not unusual for men to simply vanish in those years. The war swallowed people whole. Ike's wife eventually moved away. His children grew up elsewhere. The story died, the way stories die when there's no one left to keep telling them. But Mama Nkeruka had been young then, and she remembered something. She remembered that in the months before the war ended, there had been an argument, a bad one, between Sylvester and Ike. She didn't know what it was about. She was a young girl, and these were grown men's affairs. But she remembered raised voices. She remembered Ike Ezenwachi leaving the neighborhood one evening in a way that felt strange. And she remembered that shortly after, Sylvester began pouring the foundation of his compound. I always wondered, she told Chike, her voice low and deliberate as river water. I always wondered and never said it out loud, because some things, when you say them out loud, they become real, and real things are dangerous. Chike walked home that night very slowly. The forensic report, when it came, confirmed the bones were approximately 50 to 60 years old. They belonged to a male, likely between 30 and 40 years of age at time of death. Cause of death? Blunt force trauma to the skull. Multiple impacts. Someone had struck this man several times in the head, placed him in a shallow pit beneath the floor of the parlor, and sealed him there with fresh concrete. And then lived in that house and raised a family in that house for decades. The detective assigned to the case came to see Chike because Chike was still technically a witness. He had discovered the remains. The detective's name was Onyema, and he was the kind of man who asked questions the way a surgeon walks, precisely without wasted motion. Did you notice anything unusual when you first entered the compound? He asked. Chike thought carefully. Yes, he said, the smell. What kind of smell? I couldn't name it at the time. I thought it was just an old house, but it was different from other old houses I've walked in. Onyema wrote that down. Chike then told him about Mama Nkeruka, about Ike Ezenwachi, the business partnership, the argument, the timing of the compound's construction. Onyema listened without expression. Then he said, "Why didn't you come to us with this sooner?" Chike looked at him steadily. Because I needed to be sure I was not imagining things. The investigation deepened. Records from the 1960s were fragmented. The war had destroyed a great deal of documentation. But Onyema was patient and methodical. He found old trading licenses. He found Ike Ezenwachi's name listed as co-owner of a trading company alongside Sylvester Duru, dated 1965. He found a land registration in 1966 showing the two men had jointly purchased a plot of land, a different plot from the Duru compound, presumably for business purposes. That land had been transferred solely into Sylvester Duru's name in late 1968. Ike Ezenwachi's signature was on the transfer document. But here is the thing about that signature. When Onyema's team had it compared to other known signatures of Ike Ezenwachi from earlier documents, the trading licenses, a school record, a letter, the handwriting experts said the signature on the land transfer document did not match, not close enough, not the same hand. The document had been signed by someone else. By the time Sylvester transferred that land into his own name, Ike Ezenwachi was almost certainly already beneath the parlor floor. Emeka Duru had to be told. Onyema called him in. Chike was not present for this. He heard about it later from a source he trusted who had been nearby. Emeka, by all accounts, did not shout or protest. He sat very still, And then he said something that the detective found interesting. He said, "My father told me never to touch the floor of the old parlor. He said the concrete had been specially treated and any disturbance could compromise the structure. He told me this when I was a teenager." Not his grandfather, his father. Emeka's father had known. The knowledge had passed between generations, not loudly, not in confession, but in a quiet, specific instruction. Don't touch this floor. Don't ask why. Just don't. A secret kept so long, it had become a rule that no one questioned anymore. But now, we need to talk about what happened next, because this is where the story takes yet another turn. Because Emeka Duru did something unexpected. He went to find Ike Ezenwachi's family. Not because the police told him to, not because his lawyer advised it. Quite the opposite. His lawyer told him to say as little as possible, to cooperate minimally, to protect himself. Emeka ignored all of that. He found that Ike Ezenwachi had left behind a son, now an elderly man named Chukwuemeka Ezenwachi, 74 years old, living in Enugu. Ike's son had grown up without a father, raised by a mother who had mourned a man she never got to bury. Chukwuemeka had spent his whole adult life not knowing what had happened to his father, not knowing whether he died in the war or simply abandoned his family. That uncertainty, that not knowing, had been its own kind of grief, the worst kind. Emeka drove to Enugu, alone. He sat across from this old man, a stranger whose father his grandfather had murdered, and he told him the truth. Everything. What had been found, what the evidence suggested, what his own father had hinted at in that single damning instruction that the secret had not died with the man who created it. Chukwuemeka Ezenwachi did not speak for a very long time. Then he said, "So he was there all along." "Yes," Emeka said. "He never left us. He was there all along." And then this old man, this 74-year-old man who had spent more of his life fatherless than he had spent with his father, put his face in his hands and wept. Not crying the way you cry at something sudden, crying the way you cry when you finally get to release something you've been holding for your entire life. Emeka sat with him. He didn't touch him. He didn't offer empty words. He just sat there and let the man's grief breathe. Chike heard about this meeting from Emeka himself, because Emeka came back to the compound, came back while it was still wrapped in police tape, and stood outside the gate looking at it. Chike had driven past and seen him standing there. He stopped, he got out of his truck, he stood beside Emeka without saying anything for a while. Then Emeka said, "Did you know what you would find when you saw that patched concrete?" "No," Chike said honestly. "I only knew something was wrong. But you didn't ignore it." "I couldn't ignore it." Emeka turned to look at him. There was something raw and exhausted in his face, like a man who had put down a very heavy thing and wasn't sure who he was without the weight of it. "My grandfather built this compound on stolen land and stolen silence. My father kept that silence, and for 40 years I walked in and out of that parlor not knowing I was walking over a man's bones." He paused. "I want to give the land back. The plot my grandfather stole, the one that was transferred fraudulently, I want it returned to the Ezenwachi family." Chike was quiet. "What does your lawyer say?" he finally asked. Emeka almost laughed. "Nothing that matters." The legal proceedings took months. They were complicated by the fact that both the perpetrator, Sylvester Duru, and the primary beneficiary of the fraud, now also deceased, were dead. There were questions of inheritance, of statute of limitations, of what could and could not be proven after 60 years. But the bones were real. The forensics were real. The handwriting analysis was real. And Emeka's voluntary cooperation and testimony made things simpler in some ways, even as his family, cousins, aunts, relatives who stood to lose from any land restitution made things more complicated. There were family meetings that turned into arguments. There were phone calls in the night. There was an aunt who threatened to disinherit Emeka from other family property if he went through with the restitution. There was a cousin who called journalists hoping public pressure would stop the process. None of it moved Emeka. Ike Ezenwachi's remains were released after the forensic examination was complete. There was a burial, a proper burial, 60 years late, on land that the Ezenwachi family had chosen. Chukwuemeka Ezenwachi was there, surrounded by his own children and grandchildren. They had never had a grave to mourn at before. Now they did. Chike attended. He stood at the back, away from the family, which was where he felt he belonged. He was not family, he was merely the instrument by which the truth had surfaced. But as the coffin was lowered into the proper earth, Chike felt something in his chest release. Something he hadn't realized was coiled tight until it let go. The land restitution happened 8 months after the bones were found. It was not a large piece of land. In current market value, it was significant, but not extraordinary. But the Ezenwachi family did not care about the money. Chukwuemeka's daughter, a woman named Adana, who was a lawyer herself, said something at the small ceremony that accompanied the transfer. She said, "For my entire life, my father did not know whether his father chose to leave or was taken from him. That question shaped everything. His sense of himself, his sense of what he deserved, the story he told himself about why a man he loved disappeared." She paused. Now we know. And knowing, even a terrible knowing, is better than the dark. My grandfather can rest, and so, a little bit, can we. And the compound? Emeka made the decision that surprised everyone, including Chike. He didn't renovate it. He didn't sell it. He let the police investigation run its full course, and when the compound was finally released, he donated it to the local government with conditions attached as a community space. The old buildings, once renovated properly, would house a small library and reading room for the neighborhood's children, the first in that part of town. The parlor, that room, that specific room, would have no floor tiles, just clean, sealed concrete, unmarked, with a small plaque on the wall. The plaque gave no details. It said only, "In memory of Ideke Ezenwachi, a man who was not forgotten. He came home." Chike was eventually hired to do the renovation. Emeka called him and asked, and Chike said yes without hesitation. He worked on that compound differently from how he worked on any other building. Slower, more attentive. Every wall he repaired felt like something he was setting right. He did not rush a single day of it. On the last day of work, when everything was finished and the compound was clean and new and ready for what it was becoming, Chike stood alone in the old parlor for a few minutes. Udo and Tobena were loading the truck outside. The afternoon light came through the new windows. The plaque was on the wall. The floor was plain and smooth. Chike looked at the floor for a long time. He thought about the man who had been under it. Not the bones, the man. The man who had had a business partner and a wife and children and a whole life that someone else decided to end and then seal away in concrete and silence. A man whose family had spent 60 years not knowing. He thought about the moment Udo called to him in that flat, strange voice. "Oga Chike, come and look at something." He thought about how easy it would have been to look at that patched concrete and say nothing, to interpret it as an old repair, to mind his business and do his job and go home and never speak of it. He was glad he had been the kind of man who couldn't do that. He picked up his notebook and his pencil stub and walked out into the afternoon. Now, there's a version of this story where Chike walks past that patched concrete, where the secret stays buried, where Ike Ezenwachi's bones stay under that floor, and his family goes on never knowing, and the compound gets renovated and becomes something ordinary, and the past stays exactly where someone put it, underground, in the dark, untouched. That version of the story is terrifying because it is the more likely version. Most secrets stay buried. Most people don't look too closely at things that are not their business. Most people complete their work, collect their pay, and go home. What made Chike different was not that he was fearless. He was afraid of what he might find when they opened that patch. He did not sleep well for weeks after. What made Chike different was that he was honest. Not just about measurements and wood grain and structural integrity, honest about what he was seeing and what it meant and what he owed to the truth and to the people the truth affected, even when those people were strangers. There are things buried under the floors of the world, not always bones. Sometimes they are lies that have hardened into facts, old cruelties that everyone has agreed not to mention, injustices that became normal simply because they were never disturbed. Sometimes it takes a carpenter picking up the wrong floorboard to bring any of it into the light. And sometimes the light is terrible, and sometimes it is necessary, and sometimes it is both. If this story moved you the way it moved me when I first heard it, then please take a second and subscribe to this channel. Hit that bell, because we tell stories here that matter. Stories about the hidden things, the real things, the things that shake you and stay with you. We want you here for all of them. And if you know someone who needs to hear a story like this one, someone who believes the past always stays buried, that what's done is done, that silence is the same as peace, share this with them. Because sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply refuse to look away. Rest well, Ideke Ike Ezenwachi. You came home.